Good morning. I'm happy to present you a paper on subjective poverty and subjective equivalence scale.
Change our
Now? So is it okay now? Okay. Well, it's a joint work with my colleagues from the Institute of Sociology of Czech Academy of Sciences, Tomáš Žilinský and Kamila Fialová, and also with our dear colleague Lizia Gardner from Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington. Well, our motivation is based on the officially used indicator of poverty, officially used one in the European Union, which is the at-risk of poverty rate, as we heard already. It is defined, well, at this indicator, the poverty line is defined as 60% of median equalized income, and the income is equalized using the OECD-modified equivalence scale. This scale is used already since the 90s, and in this scale, it works so that the first adult household member has a weight of 1. The second and next adult household members have a weight of 0.5, and children up to 13 years have a weight of 0.3. And the motivation of this paper is that we believe that the economies of scale are strongly country-specific because they should depend on the consumption structure, the structure of consumption of goods with different economies of scale. I should explain that by the Eastern European countries, which I will talk about, we basically mean the new EU member states of the European Union, except Cyprus and Malta, because we focused on post-communist countries. And by Western European countries, I basically mean those 15 old EU member states. Well, so the Eastern European countries adopted this OECD-modified scale when they joined the European Union, while the previous research on the OECD-modified scale was basically based on research data from Western European countries and other countries like the US and so on. So at the time when the Eastern European countries adopted the OECD-modified equivalence scale, they simply adopted it without any research, and the differences in consumption expenditures between the two regions were basically ignored. So we assume that the economies of scale may differ generally between the Eastern European and Western European regions because of the difference in consumption structures. We formulate this hypothesis based on the data from household budget surveys. In this table, you can see the weighted averages of the two regions. And well, the highest share of consumption are represented by food and housing. Food and housing have different economies of scale. Food has quite low economies of scale, while housing has high economies of scale. And as you can see in the table, the differences in housing, the share spent on share of expenditures spent on housing is not very different between the Eastern and Western regions. Basically, in 2015, the share was pretty the same. But where is the difference? It's in the share spent on food. There is quite a huge difference, though it is decreasing over time, but still there is 10 percentage points difference in the share spent on food, and it's much higher in the Eastern European countries. So based on this, we assume that economies of scale may be lower in Eastern European countries than Western European countries, meaning that the weights in the scale for adults and children would be higher in Eastern Europe. Well, there are many methods how to estimate the equivalence scales. We follow the stream using the subjective approaches, and within these subjective equivalence scale estimations, we apply the minimum. We use the minimum income question, which is used to estimate subjective poverty, so-called subjective poverty line. The reason is quite simple, because we have this question on minimum income question in the harmonized EU self-data, so that's the reason. Well, I cannot go through the literature because it was huge, especially in the 80s and 90s. From the literature, basically, the main results regarding our research is that if the subjective poverty rates are estimated, they are typically higher than those officially used, let's say, objective income poverty indicators. And also what's typical in the literature is that the economies of scale from estimation of subjective poverty lines are typically greater, which means that the weights of adults and children in the scale are lower in the subjective approach. And that's what you will see that we basically confirm this also in our analysis. So we use the statistics on income and living conditions 2017. I wouldn't spend much time on the data set, but yeah, the minimum income question basically asks what is the very lowest net monthly income that your household needs to make ends meet. We run a standard OLS regression where the dependent variable is the subjective minimum income. It's an logarithm, it's denoted as Z. And then we have two key explanatory variables. First is the actual income of the households, also in logarithm, denoted as Y. And then another key set of key explanatory variables is the household size. Here we do it a little bit differently than it was done in previous studies, as we include two separate sets of the dummy variables, one for adults and one for children. So for adults, the reference group is one adult household, and the dummies included are for 2 adult households, 3 adult households, and more adult households, regardless the number of children. And for the children, we have reference group childless households, and we include 2 dummies. One is for households with 1 child, and the second one is for households with 2 and more children. We didn't go to upper categories because there would be enough observations. We would have about 2% of the sample of, for example, 5 and more household members. So we included just 3 dummies for adults and 2 dummies for children. And we do it because we think this is the easiest way how to derive the subjective equivalence scale, which would have the same structure as it is in the OECD modified scale. So our aim is to estimate a single weight for adults and a single weight for children. Well, then there are, of course, some other control variables. There are 2 sets of variables which we control for. The first group of variables is derived from the individual characteristics. Here we maybe do it also a little bit differently, as it is done in the literature, because usually individual characteristics of household head or some reference person is used. Well, we don't want to do this. We wanted to avoid assigning characteristics of one household member to the whole household. So instead of that, we use a share of adult households within the household with particular characteristics. So we include share of currently working adult members, share of adult females, share of members with tertiary education, and share of younger members aged 16 to 30. At the household level, we included the type of ownership of the dwelling, size of the flat or house, and degree of urbanization. And also self-assessments of the households, the assessment of their ability to make ends meet. That's a different question in the survey. And also the binary indicator of material deprivation, which is the official indicator of material deprivation used in EU still. Well, this figure shows the method how the subjective poverty line is derived. It's called the intersection method, and in this method, the minimum income, the subjective minimum income is estimated as a function of the actual income, so it's the increasing function. And the subjective poverty line is the estimation of this function with the 45-degree line. So at the intersection, at the subjective poverty line, the actual income is equal to the subjective minimum income. And we estimate this function by the OLS regression. So if we have the basic regression equation, we just set subjective minimum income equal to the actual income and easily derive the value of the subjective poverty line. Well, the original studies included only the actual income and the household size. They didn't control for any other variables, but some other studies do control, some studies do not. We do control for some other characteristics, so all these variables comes in the nominator of this expression. Well, and now how to derive the weights in the equivalence scale. This is an example for the Czech Republic on which I want to explain the methodology. Czech Republic, first, it is my country. Second, it's a country with the lowest official at-risk of poverty rate within the EU. So, for example, we estimate the weight separated for adults and for children. So, for example, for the adults, we need the subjective poverty lines for various household types. In our case, we included 3 dummies for adults, and we have 1 reference group. So we derive from the equations, we derive 4 different subjective poverty lines. And we do it easily so that for the relevant household size variables, we use the required values, and the rest of the control variables, including the dummies for children, are kept at mean values in each country. So once we have these 4 subjective poverty lines for the adults, we can derive the partial weights. We can derive partial weight for second adult, partial weight for third adult, and partial weight for 4 and more adults in the household. That's quite a standard procedure. But as we wanted to get a scale which has the same nature, the same structure as the OEDC modified scale, we want just 1 weight for adults. So from these 3 partial weights, we compute the weighted average, weighted by the structure of these types of households in the population. So finally, for the Czech Republic, we got the final weight of 0.267, and for kids, the weight is 0.1. So what we do once we have these subjective scales. First of all, our hypothesis is that we will see differences in the estimated subjective equivalence scale between Eastern and Western European countries. And once we have this scale, we actually compare the at-risk of poverty rate, the original one, the official one, and we compare it with the rate where we apply our estimated subjective equivalence scale. And then we compare also directly a subjective poverty rate with the official income poverty indicator. It's quite visible. These are the estimated subjective equivalence scale for Eastern European countries. You can see that in all cases, with the exception of 3, the estimated weights are lower than those in the OECD modified scale, which means that the economies of scale are lower. And the exceptions are for the adult weights for Bulgaria, Estonia, and Latvia. This is for Eastern European countries where the simple average for adult weights is 0.37, and for kids it's 0.11. This is the same for the Western European countries. All the weights are lower than in the OECD modified scale, and on average, the weights are lower than in Eastern European countries. And so regarding the subjective equivalence scale, we can see that with several exceptions, the economies of scale are lower in Eastern than in Western Europe as we supposed. And final two figures. Well, these two figures, with two slides, but on this slide, there are two figures which bear the very same information, but just the countries are ranked differently. At the top, and also you can see that the blue columns are the Western European countries and the orange-red colors are for Eastern European countries. At the top figure, you can see the at-risk of poverty rate, the original one, is the darker columns, compared with the at-risk of poverty rate when we use subjective equivalence scales estimated in our analysis instead of the OECD modified scale. And at the top, it's ranked according to the original at-risk of poverty rate. So the lowest poverty rate is in the Czech Republic. And at the bottom, you can see how the ranking changes if we use the subjective equivalence scale. Well, in this case, the ranking doesn't change so dramatically because basically at both the tails, still the same countries are located at both the tails. But, for example, Czech Republic jumped to third position, but if you look at the change, it's quite huge. There, the poverty increases by almost 1/2. It increases by almost 5 percentage points, which is quite huge change. So some countries are more sensitive to the weights than others. And this is the final figure where, again, at the top, we have the official at-risk of poverty rate. And the second columns are subjective poverty rates, meaning that we derive the poverty directly as a share of individuals whose actual income is lower than the estimated subjective poverty line. At the top, it's again ranked according to the official at-risk of poverty rate, and at the bottom, it's ranked by the subjective poverty rate. And here, you can already see that the ranking changes dramatically. Now we have quite a clear division on the blue and orange parts, the Western and Eastern. But, well, with these results, we had to slightly modify our hypothesis of the East-West division of the countries, because you can see that among the Eastern European countries, there are some Western European countries, but basically these are the Southern European countries. So the blue columns within the red ones are Greece, Spain, Italy, and Portugal. So the conclusion would be that once we use the subjective poverty rates, we can see more evidently the division of, let's say, Eastern plus Southern European countries versus the Western European countries. So that's all. The upper points just summarize what you saw. So finally, I would just say that we do not conclude that the subjective equivalence scales are better than the OECD modified scale or something like that. We just want to conclude that we think that that the equivalence scales should be country-specific, and that it would be more appropriate not only for country-specific purposes for social policies and so on, but also for cross-country comparisons. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you for your presentation. It is actually a very nice paper, nicely written. Just going to summarize it very quickly. You start by using the minimum income question to get new equivalent scales, and you check using the traditional definition of at risk of poverty to compare the percentage of poor, and then in the second stage you use the Goddard and co-author approach, you show the graph, to compute even, more sophisticated percentage of subjective poor. And you argue in favor of a country-specific equivalence scale. So I have only, some specific comments. Let me reread again for you the question. In your opinion, that you find in EU6. In your opinion, what is the very lowest net monthly income that your household would have in order to make ends meet, that is to pay its usual necessary expenses? Please answer in relation to the present circumstances of your household and what you consider to be usual necessary expenses to make ends meet. So what are necessary expenses? Let me give here an old quote of Karl Marx, who wrote about 170 years ago. A house may be large or small as long as the neighboring houses are likewise small. It satisfies all social requirements for a residence. But let there arise next to the little house a palace, and the little house shrinks to a hut. The little house now makes it clear that its inmate has no social position at all to maintain, or but a very insignificant one, and so on. I could also give you citation from several of the books of Robert Frank to show that the way you define necessity depends on the reference income. Now, you took indirectly into account reference income. I'll come back to this point in a minute. This idea of reference group, reference group is very important in the literature on happiness. Ada Ferreri-Carbonell, in a paper on the comparison income effect, showed not only that income of the individual or the household has some effect on well-being, but she also said that increases in family income, I'm jumping to remark 3 to make a long story short, increases in family income accompanied by identical increase in income of the reference group do not lead to significant changes in well-being. And then she drew some conclusion comparing Eastern and Western Germany. Now, as I said before, you have tried to take the reference income in your regression into account just one more remark. It's true that in the paper of Ferreri-Carbonell, the dependent variable was happiness or subject satisfaction, but I think in the same way that the comparison of an individual income in his or her reference group determines her happiness, this comparison will also determine what the individual considers as necessity. Now, as far as I know, in the USILC data, you do not have a direct question on reference income, although Bernard van Praag, a few years ago, who was one of the founders of this subjective approach to poverty, had recommended in a paper in Journal of Economic Inequality to add in surveys question of reference income. I think now there are some surveys. But you can, rather than putting a certain number of variables that you put on the right-hand side, I would rather suggest to try to estimate the reference income. You can use several approaches. You can take, a certain number of characteristics of the individual and then regress the income on this characteristic and get a predicted income. And then, you get some estimation of the reference income, or if you have information, sometimes the reference income is better measured by looking at what the standard of living people living in your area or people you're working with. So I think it would be better than that, probably better than the way you have done it in your regression. Now, what you put in your regression, if I remember, is whether the individual has a mortgage, a number of rooms, whether it's a dense area, a medium area. You have a binary variable for severe material deprivation, and also difficulty to make ends. And you're right, these are related to different living costs, habits, aspiration, expectation, as well as different reference groups. Well, you're putting together lots of things. I mean, aspiration is not a reference group, habits. So I think you need maybe to be a little bit better structured because these are different notions. Actually, in a paper, again, it's on happiness, not exactly on what you did, of Andrew Clark and Claudia Senik that use Japanese data. They estimated the reference group as a function of age, sex, and education. And you have some survey, like a paper by night, where you have on rural China, where you have a direct question on the reference group. Is your current living standard much below average, average, above average, or much above average of your village? So you don't have this in the EU Silk data, but that's why I suggested to measure indirectly. Now, there is also probably some econometric issue, although I'm not a big econometrician. You have on the right-hand side a self-assessed ability to make ends meet, great difficulty, and so on. Now, I think that the answer to this question is also the consequence of a comparison between the individual income and the reference group income. So, putting this on the right-hand side, when you have on the left-hand side, you have also on the right-hand side the logarithm of the income, may be an econometric issue, but I leave it to a sophisticated econometrician to say whether it's a problem or not. Okay, that's it.
Well, that's not much to respond. It's quite, yeah, thank you for these ideas. I know that for the happiness research, reference income is much better, of course. I will try that, yeah. I didn't do that because, yeah, there's no question on reference income, but the truth is that I can try to estimate it. Thank you.
Maybe my question is because I don't know the data set well, but thinking about how people can answer this question itself, I'm thinking of how well actually, firstly, who actually answers? Each person in the household or household head? How it works? So, because when I am the only member of household, I know very well my expenses and I can estimate. But when there are several adults, each has its own expenses, and maybe me as one of the household members don't know very well the expenses of others. And when I answer this question, I bias it a bit down because I name my own expenses plus some maybe bonus. So may it be the case that generally people in bigger households have a larger downward bias when answering this question.
Well, I'm not sure how this influences the data. Well, in EU Silk, one household member responds the questions at the household level. Well, at least in the Czech Republic, these reference persons for household questions are, well, more than 50% by, like, majority. I don't know actually how much, like 65% maybe are women. I think they have maybe more, better idea about the finances in the households than men, but that's I cannot say for sure, or it's not any subject of research. But, well, I don't know. Also, there can be differences in countries. It depends how the interviewer asks the questions. Also, it depends whether it's the last questionnaire answered, whether the individual members reply the questions before. There can be many factors. It depends where the question is in the questionnaire, whether the respondent was already thinking about all the income sources or not. There can be many factors which could bias that, but I can cannot say much about that. We could maybe ask our colleagues from, from Polish Statistical Institute. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.